Hello all. I guess I have more to say on the founders and religion. Actually, what I'm doing right now is I'm recording this webcast, sort of experimenting. I plan on uploading this to YouTube to see if I could use that as a platform for recording these podcasts, for free, because I'm a cheap ass. I don't want to have to pay any extra cost for recording these webcasts. This right here is Michael Novak's book, Washington's God, which I've read most of. The way I like to read books is I like to sort of read from chapter to chapter and skip around. Novak, he really does not prove that Washington was a Christian in the devout Orthodox sense. All he really demonstrates is that Washington invoked a warm, intervening providence as opposed to a strict, cold, distant watchmaker. So I guess Washington was not a deist in the classic sense. However, just because Washington was not a strict deist does not therefore mean he was a Christian or an Orthodox Christian. Remember, there's this whole system of theistic rationalism, theological Unitarianism, which seems to be the religion of the key founders, including Washington, and that belief system does believe in a warm, intervening providence. It's actually what's quite striking is how similar Washington and Jefferson are in their religious beliefs or in their public modes of worship. Both men were nominal Anglicans. Both men were vestrymens in the Anglican Episcopalian Church. The only major difference, I suppose, between Washington and Jefferson is that Jefferson refused to be a godfather in the Episcopal Church, whereas Washington was a godfather. When you're a godfather, you have to recite certain creeds. It's like I said, you, George Washington, do you believe X, Y, and Z that the Episcopalian Church teaches? And if, you're an intellectually honest person, you really don't believe in your heart those creeds, like Jefferson, you don't want to be a godfather because you don't want to assent to creeds in which you don't believe. Interesting thing, though, is I was emailing with Greg Fraser, and he said, well, you pretty much have to assent to those creeds in order to be a vestryman as well, and both Washington and Jefferson were vestrymen. Interesting thing, understanding the historical context of the time. I think if you understand the historical context, it really does point in the direction of the conclusion that George Washington was not an Orthodox Christian, but rather held to, quote, infidel principles. This book by David Holmes, The Faith of the Founding Fathers, as it correctly notes, is that among educated elite people in Virginia, most of them were Anglicans because Anglican Episcopalian was the dominant church. But among those educated elite Anglicans, many, if not most of them, were deists and Unitarians. They held to, quote, infidel principles. That's what the Orthodox Christians used to call the deists and Unitarians. They held to infidel principles, but they still nominally remained members of the Episcopalian or Anglican Church, more so for social reasons than as they actually believed in those particular creeds. In fact, in this book by David Holmes, they talk about, I think it's Bishop Meade, a bishop who knew James Madison's family, and he says, James Madison, his political associations were people with infidel principles, because a lot of those elite educated Whigs in Virginia and elsewhere, even though they may have been formally affiliated with a Christian church, were deist and Unitarians, or they were theistic rationalists, the term that Dr. Greg Fraser has coined. So, next question is, well, how do you tell, whether someone was a devout Episcopalian, Anglican, Christian, whatever, or whether they were one of these people who were nominally members of their church, but really privately held to infidel principles? That's a very good question. You can do a couple things. One thing you could do is you could look to their words. They could explicitly say, I am a devout Christian, or you could look to their writings like the writings of Jefferson and company, where they talk about how they explicitly reject those creeds of Orthodox Christianity in which their church believes. The problem with George Washington is he doesn't say it one way or the other. You know, Thomas Jefferson was an Episcopalian. You can look to his words, and there's explicit rejection of the creeds of Orthodox Christianity. Interesting, by the way, Patrick Henry was also an Episcopalian Anglican. He was also a Whig. And because of that, and because of all of those, quote, infidels, he got accused of being a deist or a Unitarian or an infidel because of his association with all of those Virginia Whigs who were closet Unitarians, closet infidels. And Patrick Henry, when he was accused of this, explicitly took umbrage with that and said, no, I am not. I am a devout Christian. So you have Henry being publicly on the record as being an Orthodox Christian. You have Jefferson publicly being on the record as denying that the tenets of Orthodox Christianity. George Washington kept his mouth shut. When I saw Richard Brookhiser speak, and we talked about it, asked Brookhiser a question on George Washington and religion, he said, look, George Washington held his cards close to him. He, did not say what he believed in. And reading Dr. Greg Frazier's thesis on theistic rationalism and doing some research on the internet, there were ministers who likewise in the day tried to trap George Washington and tried to get him to explicitly say what he was and what he believed in, and basically he dodged the question. Thomas Jefferson in his diary writes of this account of Washington dodging the question. Basically says, talks about how he was talking this over with Gouverneur Morris, and Morris, they were talking about how these pious ministers tried to pin Washington down, tried to say what do you really believed in, and he answered all their questions, and at the same time he dodged the Orthodox Christian question, leaving Jefferson to call Washington a cunning old fox, and said something along the lines of, Morris told me that Washington didn't believe in that system of Orthodox Christianity any more than Morris, believed in that system of Orthodox Christianity. Both Gouverneur Morris and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and likewise that they were all not Orthodox Christians, that they were all theistic rationalists or theological Unitarians. So, the context of the time, where one was expected to publicly affirm that they were Orthodox Christians, that the forces of Orthodox Christianity had a much stronger hold over society's institution. It also had much more of a legal entrenchment than a person sort of hiding in a religious closet and keeping his or her mouth shut. I mean, in my eyes, that tells me that they were not Orthodox Christians. If George Washington was an Orthodox Christian, why didn't he just, like Patrick Henry, say so? And one other thing, we all know that George Washington systematically avoided taking communion in his church, and that again, in my mind, points in the direction of Washington being not an Orthodox Christian, but a theological Unitarian, a man who held to infidel principles. Now, Michael Novak points out in his book that Washington wasn't alone, that a lot of other people, a lot of other Virginia Anglicans, Episcopalians, also did not take communion. But at the same time, that's because there were a lot of deists and Unitarians in the Episcopal Church at that time. How do you tell the difference between the Orthodox Christians and the deists and Unitarians? The deists and Unitarians were the ones that walked up and got out and left and did not take communion. And indeed, there's I think it was Dr. Abercrombie, one of Washington's ministers, who did not like the fact that Washington used to get up and walk out without taking communion. He said in his testimony, he said that this is not what Orthodox Anglicans do. This is not what Orthodox Christians do. Forgive me, I'm not going to look for the quotation. You could find it on Ferret Till's website. Maybe when I post this video, I'll actually post a link to this, but the good devout Episcopalian minister said, if you're someone who gets up and walks out without taking communion, I don't see how you could be a Christian. or an Anglican, or a devout believer. So I think that, one of the reasons why people say, well, George Washington was a deist, or George Washington was not a Christian because he used to get up and leave and didn't take communion, was because that's not something that the Orthodox Christians did. Novak points out, yeah, well, Washington wasn't alone. A lot of other people didn't take communion as well. A lot of other Virginia Episcopalians didn't take communion as well. And that just goes to show that there were a lot of deist and Unitarians, theistic rationalists, who were also nominally members of the Episcopalian Church. All right, I think I've said enough for now. I just wanted to experiment with this lecture. Hope you found it interesting.